So, Sharon, I have to say that I think the reporting on this act by the Trump administration in terms of really rolling back the Clean Water Act, to me, it has not just been unreported insofar as we live in an era where there's, so much news, it's like drinking water from a fire hose. But it's also been unreported in terms of the implications. I mean, just how severe, just where this is turning the clock back to. We often, hear, that in terms of let's say voting, the Supreme Court wants to take us back to like 1962 or something like this. In many respects, what the Trump administration is doing is taking us back to prior to 1972. But before we get to that, give us a background about the Clean Water Act. I want to do a deep dive here because this is something that people I think really need to understand just how far back we're going in terms of protection for our environment, and particularly the water we swim in and drink.
Right. Okay. Well, so the Clean Water Act passed in 1972, but leading up to it were decades of really intense industrial pollution of our waterways. And one of the events that is sort of known as setting off the fury that led to the Clean Water Act was the burning of the Cuyahoga River in Ohio in 1969. And
let me flag that because I think sometimes people hear that and they don't understand what we're talking about. The actual fire, the actual river was on fire.
So the river was coated with a layer of chemicals and slime and goo, but it was also had tracks across part of it. It was there were ironworks there. It was incredibly developed. There were many factories along the river, and they used it essentially as a dump. So chemical waste. There's the Sherwin-Williams plant when they cleaned out the tanks from their paint, they just dumped it directly in the river. Chemical plants, ironworks, and this was around the country. And so I remember hearing about this fire in 1969 and thinking, oh my, it must have been so crazy there. And indeed it was. But this was something that was actually happening around the country. It was not that unusual for rivers to catch fire. And in fact, the Cuyahoga had caught fire, I believe, 8 or 9 times before this particular one in 1969 that everybody knows about. So it was very widespread, this level of pollution, and we were just beginning to get into sort of the chemical age with waste from chemical plants dumped directly again into the water or in ditches that led into the water. So you had
Sharon, let me interrupt you for just 1 second so that we get a full picture of this. And I have to say that I've spoken to people. I've spoken to people who lived in Cleveland at that time, and there was apparently a joke about the Sherwin-Williams plant. Like we could tell which paint they were working on that day because that was the color of the Cuyahoga River.
Yes.
But give us a sense of just like were there laws? Were laws not on a federal level? Were they state or?
I don't know the extent to which there were state laws regulating pollution, but I know that on the federal level, there weren't water quality standards. And that's what the Clean Water Act brought. It was one of those things where the nation kind of awakens, one of those moments where we just kind of reached our collective limit. And so this fire wasn't the only fire, but it seems to be sort of the, last straw on the camel's back or whatever that just, led us to say it was covered in Time magazine. And they went on about how it was like chocolate brown stew of cesspool, I think they called it. And I think people went, yuck, this is disgusting and it's unsafe and it smells bad. And so for the first time, we had these limits on how much you could put into water, and not just big waters, but little waters. And it was, if you wanted to release into water, this introduced the era of the permit. You needed a permit that would give you permission to dump X amount of Y into the river, and in order to enforce it, the government could measure the water, look for that chemical or a substance, and then if it was over, you would be fined or held accountable. So it was a new way of looking at water.
And to what extent was there, I mean, at that time, I think it's hard for us in this day and age to imagine a situation where people are living next to a body of water. I mean, certainly some people, but broadly speaking, to be living next to a body of water that runs down, and I know obviously, I'm in New York. We had a real problem with the Hudson River and the East River, and the Gowanus Canal is very close to us here. But even as nasty as the Gowanus Canal is, to be living next to a major river that itself is like physically, like you can smell it, see it, experience how polluted it is, just by standing near it, as opposed to the notion of like, we're having a rash of cancers coming from this area or something like that. I mean, surely the implications of this were far greater than people understood. It was just, it was so bad that it was that explicit. Do we have a sense of, like, in that era, how much illness was caused by this, like long-term illness?
I don't know. I haven't looked at studies that look at that in terms of, long-term effects. I'm sure some of the cancers, which you imagine that, these chemicals would cause, they wouldn't necessarily happen right at the time of contact, but probably years later. And certainly we've seen a big rise in cancer over that time.
And of course, this was just basically corporations taking the opportunity to use these essentially unregulated spaces as their own private dumps.
Yeah, it was convenient. Yes.
And a classic example of a corporation essentially privatizing their profits and socializing the costs here, because it's not just convenient, right? It's cheaper for them. I guess I wonder if there's, and I doubt that you're aware of it, but I could imagine that there are economists out there who could have, if they didn't, assess the billions of dollars in costs that these corporations were saving on one hand, and B, they were costing the rest of us. And when we take a break here, when we come back, I want to talk about if you are aware of the cost that it took to sort of clean up these messes. And then going forward, we'll talk about the Clean Water Act, which theoretically and I frankly, I think in practice, largely made it possible for us to have more or less clean water in this country, and all that means. We got to take a quick break. I'm talking to Sharon Lerner. This is A Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. We'll be back in a moment.